and Shubhodeva, voyages from the periphery welcomes to another online lecture. Today, our esteemed guest is Dr. Anindya RayChaudhuri, sir, who will speak on Stomach is Offended, Dizziness and Vertigo as an embodiment of crisis of ingestion. Dr. Anindya RayChaudhuri is a British Academy postdoctoral fellow at the University of St. Andrews, and he is a distinguished editor of the Journal of the Oral History Society and the Spanish Civil War, exhuming a buried past. Honored as one of the BBC AHRC New Generation Thinkers of 2016, he brings a profound commitment to unveiling the silenced narratives of history. His scholarship navigates realms of postcolonial and diasporic identities, cultural representation, and the collective memory of war and conflict woven through the lens of Marxist and critical theory. Among his acclaimed works, Narrating South Asian Partition, Oral History, Literature, Cinema explores the lingering divides of partition, while Homemaking, Radical Nostalgia, and Construction of South Asian Diaspora delves into the intimate act of crafting home within the diaspora. Through his writing, RayChaudhuri captures the delicate interplay of memory and identity, revealing the resilience and humanity that emerge from the fractured pasts. Some of his important works are, as I have already narrating South Asian Partition, and also he also wrote journal articles like "They Don't Call Us Indian," Indian Muslim Voices, and the 1947 India-Pakistan Partition. Certain orally and religion in narratives of 1947 India-Pakistan Partition. So without any further delay, I would like to invite Dr. RayChaudhuri, sir. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the generous invitation and the generous introduction there. It's lovely to see all of you. I'm just going to try to share my PowerPoint presentation. Just see if I can. Can someone please tell me if you can see my PowerPoint? Is my PowerPoint visible?
It is now.
You can see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
So the talk I'm giving today is based on or part of the current project that I'm working on, which in many ways is very different from the previous work I've done, as was outlined by the chair very generously. So since my work on partition and since my work on South Asian diaspora, I've moved a little bit towards what we might call critical medical humanities or disability studies, using the particular sort of example, a particular case study of vertigo. So the talk is based on a chapter of what will hopefully be a monograph on a cultural history of vertigo. I'll speak for about 45 minutes, something like that. I've got some pictures and some videos to show, and then I'd love to have questions and comments. It's very much work in progress. This is the work I'm doing at the moment. So any advice, suggestions, comments would be gratefully received. The genesis of the project of which this talk is a part dates back to December 2019, when, after a number of episodes of acute and debilitating vertigo, I was diagnosed with something called Meniere's disease. This is a condition of the inner ear, which manifests itself in tinnitus, so buzzing in your ear, hearing loss, this is my bad ear, and episodic bouts of vertigo. Associated with disorders of the balance system, vertigo, as defined by the National Health Service in the UK, is, quote, the feeling that you or everything around you is spinning. For me, the initial feeling is not dissimilar to seasickness, a difficult to describe sensation of unsteadiness, as if the world is swaying ever so slightly. Sometimes this sensation will proceed to a 360-degree spinning, and I might have to call on the kindness of friends to help me back home. And then, often literally on my hands and knees, I will have to crawl to bed. I will not be able to function for a few hours at least. Each episode may not last that long, but the lingering effects in terms of exhaustion, disorientation, and disempowerment can last for days. Vertigo is a symptom associated with disorders of the balance system, the vestibular system of our bodies, and it disrupts our ability to locate and define ourselves in the world. You are no longer sure of the ground on which you stand. You look at space differently, and you are forced to re-examine the boundary between you, between your body, and the rest of the world. If you cannot tell if the walls around you are spinning or not, how can you be sure of anything? In the words of Susan Stewart, vertigo and dizziness, quote, is a threshold activity. Subjectivity and objectivity come quite close to each other, enacting, we might add, an existential crisis in the subject. So vertigo then is above all a disruption. When I have an episode, it disrupts my day. It disrupts my location in and my relationship to the world. It is thus not surprising that vertigo has proved to be a rich, almost irresistible metaphor to think about a wide range of disruptions and crises. David Matsine has used the metaphor to talk about the dizzying sensation following prolonged oppression and delusions of skin color. You see the book Apartheid Vertigo. Daniel Knight has used it to describe the experience of the financial crisis in Greece, writing about vertiginous life. Jock Young has deployed vertigo to refer to a sense of insecurity, of insubstantiality. He writes about the vertigo of late modernity. Philip Blom has used it to think about the feeling of a rapidly accelerating world in the lead up to the First World War. He describes those 14 years as the vertigo years. Associated as it is with disorientation, confusion, anxiety, trauma, insight, crisis, and exhilaration, one can see how vertigo can become a way to talk about disruption of any kind. But how do these metaphors work if you take into account the experience of someone for whom the vertiginousness of the world is a daily physical challenge? How does the metaphor in turn affect the way vertigo is lived with, the way vertigo is experienced? So the widespread use of this metaphor, I argue, needs to be studied in conjunction with the embodied experience, the lived experience of vertigo. Borrowing from Vivian Sobchak's work on the prosthetic, Sobchak uses the metaphor of the prosthetic leg, and she talks about her own prosthetic leg, and she says, we can talk about the metaphors as long as we want, but my prosthetic leg will not go dancing on its own without me. So can we redress this metaphorical displacement through a return to its premises in lived body experience is a question that Sobchak asks. And in the context of the vertigo metaphor, this is also a question I'm asking. What happens if we connect vertigo as metaphor and vertigo as lived experience? Since my diagnosis, based on the theory that if life gives you lemons, you may as well research how to make lemonade, I began a research project on a cultural history of vertigo. I aim to examine vertigo and its many meanings. It is a pathology. It is a lived experience. It is a narrative device. It is a cultural metaphor. Using accounts from history of medicine, ethnographic interviews, and literary and cultural representation, I'm trying to figure out these connections between vertigo as metaphor and vertigo as symptom. Since April 2022, I've interviewed 31 people who live with vertigo associated with a range of conditions about their experiences of and their feelings about their vertigo. So when Susan Stewart describes it as a threshold activity, she is more interested in vertigo as metaphor than she is in vertigo as symptom. But it is also true that vertigo as symptom is concerned with the limits and margins of the body. Vertigo is immediately and materially centered on what one's body ingests and what it expels. A realignment of the subject, the subject that is the body, that is in fact an existential crisis of the subject. So in today's talk, I will study a few examples from medical accounts of vertigo, from my interviews, and from literary and cultural production to explore how vertigo is associated with and comes to be defined through this dynamic of ingestion and expulsion, what we allow into our body and what we expel out of our body. In being defined by what we take in and what we expel, I argue that vertigo becomes constitutive. Vertigo constitutes my body in new ways. My body is different from having become a vertiginous body. So the subject-object dynamic in terms of ingestion, what invades the body and how the body might react to this invasion, is clear from one of the very earliest accounts of dizziness from the 3rd century BC. This is Theophrastus of Eresus. He, in a treatise called On Dizziness, he connects vertigo to certain types of nourishment, for example, either from wine or from some other juice. For Theophrastus, when, quote, an alien breath or, quote, some alien excess enters into the brain which is fluid by nature, it forces its way in, percolating to the vessels and drives the fluid that is there in a circle. So you have the body's own fluid, excess fluid from outside, alien fluid comes in and then drives the whole thing in a circular motion. And that, Theophrastus says, is what causes dizziness. The repeated use of the word alien, the idea of an extraneous force, an extraneous fluid that pushes in. At the heart of Theophrastus's analysis is this sense that vertigo redraws the boundary between subject and object, based in part on what we might today call food triggers. As we will go on to see, much of the metaphorical use of food triggers in cultural representation recycles similar ideas about the transformative powers of alien invasions. We need to eat to live, but by eating, we become something different. We become something other. Throughout a lot of early medical scholarship about vertigo, this anxiety plays out through a use of balance and how food triggers upset the natural balance, i.e. the body's ability to maintain balance, in terms of a metaphorical balance between the relationship between the stomach and the brain. So in 1649, Thomas Johnson published his English translation of the Latin works of French surgeon Ambroise Paré, in which they discuss various types of vertigo. Also, it ofttimes riseth from the stomach, spleen, liver, and other entrails being too hot, Paré says. In 1667, John Tanner discusses a type of vertigo that he associates between, again, the relationship between the head and the stomach, believing that if gnawing of the stomach or a disposition to vomit precede the fit, then the disease proceeded from the mouth of the stomach. In 1701, John Jones develops these ideas by providing more detail to the relationship between the head and the stomach, as he sees it. Jones argues that the swimming in the head and the offense of the brain happens because the stomach is offended. Eating or drinking certain things, allowing certain foreign or alien things into one's body, threatens its cohesive wholeness. The body is no longer one thing, but many, including a head and a stomach. If the relationship between these two organs is less than harmonious, the result is vertigo. Obviously, these accounts differ in various ways from contemporary medical opinion, which has moved on quite a lot. But there is, in contemporary medical opinion, a similar agreement when it comes to connections between ingestion and the balance systems, even though it is described and imagined rather differently. Writing in 2013, Bella Bucchi and Alexander A. Tarnitzer find that food triggers may be the cause of 50% of vertigo attacks in cases of vestibular migraines. There are multiple theories that connect vertigo as symptom to what and how we allow in our bodies. A number of scientists have observed mastication-induced dizziness, or dizziness coming from chewing, and this is explained either through an actual physical connection between the trigeminal, so to do with the jaws and the chewing, and the vestibular systems, specific nerve connections between these two systems, or because, in a particularly interesting theory, the idea that chewing leads to the illusion of rhythmic movement of the viewed world. As you chew, your head moves up and down, your balance system moves, and therefore it creates an illusion of rhythmic movement, which causes vertigo. So across all these medical opinions, these accounts may span 2 millennia, but there is a through line connecting them as well. The sense that vertigo enacts an existential crisis in the subject by blurring its physical boundaries. and therefore redefining, relocating my relationship with my world. Vertigo rewrites my bodily limits, forcing me to focus on what Julia Kristeva describes as the border of my condition as a living being. Food triggers, like most triggers of vertigo, are hard to identify definitively. Any particular trigger might not actually lead to an attack always, or even often, so the unpredictability becomes part of the overall disorientation. On initial diagnosis, one is often asked to give up caffeine, salt, and alcohol, as they're seen to be common triggers, though fortunately they made absolutely no difference for me. The only food trigger I think I have been able to identify, bizarrely, is aspartame. Aspartame is one of the sweeteners often used in sugar-free soft drinks. The sporadic nature of triggers means it is difficult to say for certain. One follows a sort of trial and error process whereby one starts to notice patterns between certain acts of consumption and subsequent attacks of vertigo. Gradually, one forms associations with one or more foodstuff and the dizziness and nausea of vertigo, so that there is a clear, new, powerful, and effective response. So I believe aspartame is a trigger for me. I cannot be sure in scientific terms. It is true that there is some evidence to suggest that aspartame may be a trigger for vertigo. In their study of vestibular cochlear toxicity, Paul Pizarnik and Dasha Kai suggested that, quote, suggesting cessation of aspartame use may be beneficial for patients with dizziness, vertigo, tinnitus, or high-frequency hearing loss. Anecdotal evidence and comments on the many online fora and support groups also suggest that I am not the only one who may be thus affected. Bob, one of my interviewees, shares my apparent susceptibility to aspartame. In my interview with her, she describes how she and her husband will religiously check the back of stuff to make sure she doesn't ingest it and inadvertently trigger her vertigo. Like Bob, I too have to carefully read the list of ingredients to check that I'm not ingesting it by mistake. And in a quite an interesting sort of emotional process, I now associate things that contain aspartame with increased attacks of vertigo, rightly or wrongly, and all the visceral unpleasantness that involves. As is the case for many food triggers and intolerances, one realizes how many things contain aspartame: soft drinks, but also chewing gum, sweets, and even some cold and flu remedies. Walking past fridges in supermarkets full of sugar-free soft drinks that I could once safely consume, but now no longer believe I can, is an everyday experience. Slowly but surely, the foodstuff in question starts assuming this strange, uncanny force, at once mundane and familiar, but now possessing a new malevolent power, reminding me of how my post-vertigo world has transformed in many ways. If, as I am arguing here, vertigo is centrally concerned about boundaries, and specifically the self-other subject-object boundary, then food triggers, what one ingests into one's body, and the vertigo one associates with what one expels from one's body, highlights what Julia Kristeva might describe as the particularly abject nature of vertigo. Aspartame for me becomes similar to Kristeva's skin on the surface of milk, provoking a similar anxiety about physical nausea. The foodstuff has become abject in my imagination, associated irredeemably with the fragility of my vertigo. Eventually it gets to a point where every time I see something containing aspartame, I'm reminded irresistibly of vertigo, of nausea, of the experience of vomiting. As Kristeva writes about the concept of the abject, these bodily fluids, this defilement, this shit, are what life withstands, hardly and with difficulty, on the part of death. There I am at the border of my condition as a living being. My body extricates itself as being alive from that border. Such wastes drop so that I might live, until, from loss to loss, nothing remains in me, and my entire body falls beyond the limit. So my first encounter with Kristeva's work predates by many years my onset of vertigo. As I started to learn to live in a post-vertigo world, my thoughts kept returning to her idea of the abject and how so many aspects of vertigo make manifest her thinking. It was only when I actually returned to her text, however, that I noticed how many explicit references to vertigo there are in her writing. At the very beginning of Powers of Horror, in describing her reaction to the skin on the surface of milk, another border, of course, Kristeva writes, quote, I experience a gagging sensation, and still farther down, spasms in the stomach, the belly, and all the organs shrivel up the body, provoke tears and bile, increase heartbeat, cause forehead and hands to perspire, along with sight-clouding dizziness. Nausea makes me balk at that milk cream. Later in the same essay, Kristeva refers to the, quote, discomfort, unease, dizziness that stems from ambiguity. Elsewhere in Powers of Horror, Kristeva refers to dizziness, noises, buzzings, vomitings in the work of anti-Semitic French author Louis Ferdinand Céline. About his description of seasickness, Kristeva writes, quote, dizziness finds its language, one of literature's most abominable scenes of abjection or nausea is unleashed. Citing Jorge Luis Borges, Kristeva claims that the object of literature is, in any case, vertiginous and hallucinatory. She repeatedly deploys the metaphor of vertigo when discussing the phobia as a psychoanalytic object. She describes the extreme nimbleness of the phobic adult speech as a vertiginous skill. For Kristeva, the semiotic nature of language itself is dizzying. Quote, a motion metaphor binding significance, rotation, vertigo, or infinite quest. It is remarkable, and perhaps an indictment of my lack of attentiveness as a reader, that I had either missed or forgotten much of this vertigo in Kristeva's writing when I first read Powers of Horror. But it perhaps also speaks to the ways in which a corporeal metaphor, no matter how complex and sophisticated, necessarily changes its meaning when it is no longer simply metaphorical. A metaphor can be useful, attractive, exciting, even liberatory in various ways. It is less likely to be felt deep in one's bones, though. The metaphorical use of vertigo and nausea to think through the different possible means of abjection may well be important, but one is perhaps less able to feel the vertigo in one's guts until one has experienced vertigo as symptom. Or to put it another way, if one is living with a vertigo that is all too real, one might not, following Vivian Sobchak, find it nearly as seductive a matter or generalized an idea as someone who doesn't. For many of my interviewees, vertigo is very much something to do with one's guts. Sean, for example, talks about how careful he has to be about what he chooses to ingest. For ZH, stress about food-based decisions become part of and added to other stresses of life.
Hello.
It is perhaps this sense of vertiginous disorientation associated with food that has meant it has also occasionally featured as a marker for vertigo as metaphor. A particularly interesting example of food causing vertigo can be seen in Lewis Carroll's 1865 work Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Suffused as the narrative is with foodstuffs of various kinds, it is tempting to read it as an elaborate metaphor for food-triggered vertigo. Alice changes again and again through what she chooses to eat and drink. When she first picks up the bottle marked Drink Me and tastes of it, she finds it very nice. The drink produces a curious feeling, as Alice finds she's shrinking rapidly until she's only 10 inches high. Next, Alice eats the cake marked Eat Me and finds that she is opening out like the largest telescope that ever was. Alice's distortion of perception has resulted in the formal identification of Alice in Wonderland syndrome, a neurological disorder associated with migraines, head injuries, or viral infections. This may result in objects appearing smaller or larger, or closer or farther than in reality. When J. Todd first identified and reported it in 1955, he interestingly ignored the dietary element completely, commenting merely that, quote, Alice in her dreams sometimes became remarkably tall or remarkably short. Subsequent practitioners have referred to the role of diet in managing the syndrome. Edward J. Fine, I beg your pardon, outlines the dietary connections to migraine, postulating that, quote, the physiology of migraines may explain Alice's metamorphopsias and confusional state. But generally speaking, food triggers have not been prominent in the list of causes discussed in the medical discussions of the syndrome, Alice in Wonderland syndrome. This is odd, certainly, given the prominence of food and the food-related vertiginous disorientation with which the novel is suffused throughout. Later on, when Alice encounters a drink that will make her bigger, she says, I know something interesting is sure to happen whenever I eat or drink anything, so I'll just see what this bottle does. People whose vertigo is triggered by food may find themselves nodding in sympathy. Indeed, the effect of the drink on Alice is interesting in its vertiginousness. She went on growing, and very soon had to kneel down on the floor. In another minute there was not even room for this, and she tried the effect of lying down with one elbow against the door and the other arm curled round her head. Still she went on growing, and as a last resource she put one arm out of the window and one foot up the chimney and said to herself, Now I can do no more, whatever happens. What will become of me? The topsy-turvy nature of the Wonderland is exemplified by a deliberate confusion between the eater and the eaten. This confusion starts even before Alice has arrived in Wonderland, as she falls down the deeply vertiginous rabbit hole. Quote, and here Alice began to get rather sleepy, and went on saying to herself in a dreamy sort of way, Do cats eat bats? Do cats eat bats? And sometimes, do bats eat cats? For, you see, as she couldn't answer either question, it didn't much matter which way she put it. End quote. It is this confusion that means the act of ingestion is associated with a real existential crisis. As Alice starts to shrink, she starts to worry about shrinking too far, into oblivion. She felt a little nervous about this, for it might end, you know, said Alice to herself, in my going out altogether, like a candle. I wonder what I should be like then. And she tried to fancy what the flame of a candle is like after the candle is blown out, for she could not remember ever having seen such a thing. There is, it seems to me, a connection between 17th and 18th century medical scholarship on stomachal vertigo and the effect the cakes and drinks have on Alice. We have already seen how what one eats and how much can threaten the body's cohesion, so that the balance between stomach and brain is disrupted. As Alice is alternately shrunk and enlarged, she stops being a single coherent organism and becomes, instead, a set of loosely connected parts. As she grows, she becomes disconnected from her feet. The description is the feet become so far from her that they become she's less connected to them than she was before. She starts talking to her feet and she says, Who will put on your shoes and stockings for you now, dears? In the next moment, she reminds herself to be nice to her feet, or perhaps they won't walk the way I want to go. Anyone who lives with vertigo as symptom will know only too well the fear that one's feet will stop obeying one's instructions. The vertiginous body is, like Alice's, never entirely within one's control. When the caterpillar advises Alice that one side of the mushroom will make her taller, while the other will make her shorter, this advice is made less than helpful because Alice does not know which side he is referring to. Eating the mushrooms, like eating the cake and drinking from the bottle, makes Alice's body behave in unpredictable ways. She nibbled a little of the right-hand bit to try the effect. The next moment she felt a violent blow underneath her chin. It had struck her foot. As is so often the case with vertigo as metaphor, this may well mean something different for people who live with vertigo as symptom. For someone who has collapsed from vertigo before, the thought of one's chin hitting one's foot may not be simply a sign that one is in a topsy-turvy wonderland. It may just be that dizziness and vertigo instead makes for a distinctly unpleasant topsy-turvy reality. If food can be a trigger and therefore a source of stress, so can alcohol. Here is Sean again. The correlation between alcohol and vertigo is such that when asked to describe the experience of vertigo, many of my interviewees refer to the sensation of being drunk, as Ben puts it, describing his first ever episode.
Excuse me, sir. Sorry to interrupt you. Sir, I think the slides are not working.
The
Because
slides are not
we can.
working.
Yes, we're seeing the first. Yes, yes. Now it's working. Uh,
So you haven't seen any of the slides until now?
no, sir. No, sir.
I mean, I asked you if the
We
slides
have
were working at the start and you said yes.
Yes, that time it was working because you have opened the first slide, but uh, after that it hasn't been moved. And yes,
Okay,
yes.
it
Now
would
I
have
can
been
see the
helpful.
slide number 17. Yes.
It would have been helpful to have heard that before, because obviously you haven't seen anything that I've said so far. Anyway, can you hear this now?
Yes, sir. It's fine. It's all right, sir.
Hello, can't hear. We can't hear anything.
You can't hear anything.
No.
just your voice.
Okay. Again, it would have been helpful if someone had said this, in the last half an hour or whatever. Okay, I will read the quotes again. So Ben's saying it was early in the morning and I woke up. It felt very early in the morning. I woke up and I felt kind of weird. A bit like when you've had too much to drink and the ceiling feels like it's kind of open. I got out of bed to go to the bathroom. I got out of bed and I just fell over. I couldn't stand up. I pretty much crawled to the bathroom. Okay. So this is a running trope through much of vertigo literature. The idea that the sensation of drunkenness is a good shorthand to describe the sensation of vertigo. Ambrose Parry's description of vertigo is a case in point. Parry says the vertigo is a sudden darkening of the eyes and sight, moving the humours and spirits which are contained there, and tossing them unequally as if one ran around or had drunk too much wine. Note that Parry's imagined patient does not get their vertigo from drinking too much wine. Rather, their vertigo makes it seem as if they had too much wine. For John Jones, the relationship between alcohol and vertigo is much more causal. Swimmings in the head are by consent because the stomach is grieved, as when it is overloaded with wine. It is no coincidence that substance-induced vertigo becomes a common method for disorientation and existential crisis. A rather random example can be seen in Rockstar Games' 2013 blockbuster video game Grand Theft Auto 5. There are two particular missions in which Michael, one of the characters you play as, gets drugged. In one, he is given a drink laced with acid by his son Jimmy. The physical environment gets distorted as Michael's and the player's vision is compromised. Michael ends up hallucinating an alien abduction, followed by a free fall through the skies over San Andreas. Now, I have a video. I don't know if the video will work because obviously the sound isn't working, but is this video working?
Yes, sir. It's okay. The sound.
It doesn't matter if you don't have the sound. It is or not.
Oh, it's fine, sir. Then it's working. Yes, sir.
So, as you saw from the short video, the physical environment gets distorted as Michael's and the player's vision is compromised. Michael ends up hallucinating an alien abduction, followed by a free fall through the skies over San Andreas. The player has little or no control here, again mimicking a little too uncomfortably the sensation of disempowerment caused by vertigo. At the end of the sequence, Michael flies into a Ferris wheel, which dissolves into a series of concentric circles. In another mission, Michael smokes marijuana, which has probably been laced with something else, resulting in a similarly hallucinogenic experience, accompanied by visual and auditory distortions. The trees and the buildings appear spectral, bending and breaking to depict a vertigo perspective. This episode of hallucination also features aliens, as Michael has to stumble around trying to kill them. There's another video, if the sound doesn't work, that's okay, but you can see the bending and breaking that I'm trying to describe. Now, it might seem trivial to focus on such isolated examples, which, even in the game world in which they inhabit, are meaningless side missions. But the emotional, the affective experience of playing or watching these sequences feels more than trivial, however. Even now, after having played GTA 5 many times, I find it a bit difficult to watch these missions. The effect they create for me is so unpleasantly reminiscent of Vertigo, and the disempowerment as a player is so palpable that these missions still have the power to shock, to disrupt my experience of the game as a whole. Transcending the aestheticized violence characteristic of Grand Theft Auto is this vulnerability, this sense of fragility that I associate with Vertigo, the sense memory of swaying and weaving, bumping into walls, or the feeling that one is falling backwards, upwards maybe, through a non navigable space. As is so often the case with representations of vertigo, these sequences seem to evoke a vertigo of its own as well, so that I often have to look away to regain my bearings. Now, it's of course extremely unlikely that the game makers were thinking of Theophrastus and his alien breath when designing these scenes of vertigo, but I don't think it is a complete coincidence either that both of these missions feature aliens. Vertigo, whether substance induced or not, distorts one's perspective on the world and therefore one's sense of the self. One's body, remember Alice, no longer seems to be under one's control, so it makes complete sense that again and again cultural narratives have deployed the alien metaphor. There is, of course, a long history of associating alcohol and narcotics with a distorted perspective. James Ensor's The Drunkards from 1883 is a perfect example. The two drunkards are sitting at a table. One of them has apparently lost the ability to sit upright. The other can still manage to be erect, but his legs are abnormally long, extended out towards the viewer. He may still be sitting up, but the legs do not seem like they will be able to bear his weight should he choose to stand up. He is holding on to his leg, as if he is scared of his body literally falling apart. 7 years after Ensor's painting, Vincent van Gogh painted The Drinkers. Alcohol has begun to physically distort the world as the bodies of Van Gogh's figures dissolve into waves of color. The preponderance of greens suggests, at the very least, that the drink they are imbibing is absinthe. The figure at the bottom left of the painting looks like they have lost the ability to stand up, while the others seem to be somehow defying the laws of physics in their erectness. The distorted perspective forces one to question one's own view. Are we part of this group, a fifth person at the table, who is just as inebriated as the others? Is that why the world appears to be moving in waves? Similarly, Nicole Eisenman's 2011 painting Sloppy Barroom Kiss depicts an alcohol-induced, distorted world where the people and the inanimate objects appear somehow out of kilter, unbalanced. Look, none of the lines appear to be straight. The figure's hands appear to be slightly distorted. The bar sign at the back almost seems like it's falling to one side with the paint dripping off the word of the letter B. In order to join these worlds of drunks, one must, it seems, assume the perspective of a drunk. Across all of these paintings, there is what we might describe as a vocabulary of vertigo. The effects of alcohol are being depicted through the tropes of distorted perspective that suggests movement where there logically cannot be any, which results in a world where neither physics nor anatomy seem to be following their expected rules. Not unlike Alice, we seem to see things as abnormally large or abnormally small. There are few straight lines, none of which allow us to assume a stable viewing perspective. Our distorted perspective mirrors that of the drunken perspective, who has often collapsed, unable to stand straight, having to hold on to support themselves in this world of swimming, wavy lines. These characteristics are also, of course, the characteristics of vertigo. In his poem My Papa's Waltz, American poet Theodore Rothko describes the narrator's drunken father using a very similar set of tropes. The father smelled so strongly of whiskey that it, quote, could make a small boy dizzy. The waltz of the title seems to apply not just to the people, but to objects. The pans slid from the kitchen shelf. The drunk's world is also one of vertiginous movement. Nothing is stable and still. At the end of the poem, the little boy is, quote, still clinging to your shirt, and as readers, we have to desperately try to hold on. Rothko's metaphor of the waltz is the literary equivalent to Van Gogh's Waves and Isenson's Off Kilter Barroom, suggesting movement where there should be stillness and stability. These metaphorical trails are put to work to convey the many meanings of alcoholism: ridiculous farce, tragic pathos, and menacing violence. Of course, for those of us who suffer from vertigo as symptom, these trails are much more than metaphorical and have little to do with violence or tragedy. The sense of uncontrollable movement in the world of these drunken subjects vertiginously reminds us of the many times our bodies seem to be whirling or moving beyond our control. The reason why I and others living with vertigo may find it difficult to look at these images is because they mimic a little too accurately for comfort what the body does when its balance is disrupted, what it feels like when one has an episode. It could be argued that this is in fact a perfectly accurate description of someone who is drunk or high, but like all forms of representation, this too involves choices and creates patterns of its own. When the major mode of representation of drug and alcohol use looks precisely like an episode of vertigo, it is not surprising that people witnessing someone having vertigo often assume that person must have taken alcohol or drugs. There have been multiple occasions where I've had an episode in public, sitting or lying down, often violently sick, and it is obvious to me even in that condition that people walking by were assuming that I was drunk. To say this is not to justify prejudice, often class, race, and gendered in various ways, against people identified as substance abusers. It is to say that the lack of visibility when it comes to balance disorders adds to the sense of disorientation and misplaced shame that is familiar to many people living with vertigo. As Ben puts it very eloquently, I guess someone that looks, normal, this idea of what a normal person should look like, suddenly starting to look weird and not normal and swaying. And those, I guess, we associate drunkenness. For example, I was at a party and I probably had a bit to drink, but not like a huge amount. And I was holding up quite a large bottle of beer, like one of those Spanish oversized bottles. And it just slipped out of my hand and fell to the floor and kind of smashed. And I thought, like, I've kind of got like the physical symptoms of being a lot more drunk than I am. And I just kind of slipped off home without saying goodbye to anyone. I just felt at that point, I think I felt like I just didn't want to have a social life anymore. And I felt like I'm going to be unable to kind of just hang out with people. One of the consequences of the ubiquity of vertigo as metaphor is that the lived experiences of vertigo as symptom risk getting elided. A wider social and cultural focus on the widespread nature of vertigo as symptom may help both to design a world that is more accessible for people with balance disorders and serve to remind everyone that the body that is lying on a pavement may not actually be drunk. If ingestion becomes indelibly associated with vertigo, so does expulsion. Given the widespread understanding of vertigo through much of medical scholarship from the 16th to the 19th centuries as caused by excessive ingestion, or the body's pathological response to ingestion, it is not surprising that for many doctors there is a clear connection between vomiting and vertigo. For Ambrose Paré, vomiting is both a cure for and an index of the seriousness of vertigo. I won't read the whole quote, but he goes on to say, if the origin of the disease proceed from the heat of the entrails, then purging is a solution. So you have to purge the body by making it vomit. But then he also says, if such a vertigo be a critical symptom of some acute disease affecting the crisis for vomit or bleeding, then the whole business of freeing the patient thereof must be committed to nature. For the anonymous author of The London Practice of Physic, vomiting and associated purges are necessary as a remedy of vertigo. Vomiting is necessary, this author says, when it proceeds from a foul stomach. For Erasmus Darwin, in his text Zoonomia, it is the experience of vertigo itself that becomes associated with emesis and other forms of excretion. Again, I won't read the whole quote, but it says, a violent vertigo, from whatever cause it happens, is generally attended with unusual excretion of bile and gastric juice, with much pale urine. And then goes on to talk about when a patient is inclined to vomit from other causes, this vomiting induces a degree of vertigo. More recently, physicians have proposed an evolutionary theory. In 1977, Michel Treisman theorized that motion sickness-induced vomiting, or emesis, which is of course connected to vertigo, might be explained by the body evolving, quote, an ideal warning system for detecting early sinful effects of neurotoxins. Vomiting gets associated with vertigo through contemporary popular culture as well. When Regan in William Friedkin's The Exorcist is possessed by the devil, it is not just that her head that spins in a manner that is deeply vertiginous. It is not just that the furniture of her bedroom moves around violently, mimicking an episode of vertigo, but she also vomits, copiously and forcefully. Regan may well be possessed, there may well be an alien presence inside her, but the material that her body has expelled must, one fears, have come from inside her. Vertigo compels the expulsion of these noxious fluids, simultaneously reminding us of what we are literally carrying around inside of ourselves. In Julia Kristeva's words, these are the wastes that drop so that I might live, in and through a process of abjection that supposedly demonstrates the solidity of the subject, but actually reinforces its incoherence and fragility in the same moment. If nausea associated with vertigo as metaphor becomes a device with which to negotiate these existential anxieties, these forms of representation may also evoke a physiological nausea in turn. Nausea features prominently in the work of British painter Francis Bacon, both in the execution of the art and its reception. See, for example, on the slide Triptych, May-June 1973, one of the many that he painted in memory of his lover George Dyer, who had killed himself in 1971. The panel on the left shows a distorted human figure sitting on a toilet. The head appears to have collapsed into his chest, the whole body writhing as if in pain. The middle panel shows a more serene, contemplative figure, also apparently sitting on a toilet. The body, albeit still deformed, is more human-like than the first, but is taken over by an enormous bat-like demonic shadow. In the panel on the right, the figure is hunched over a sink. There is no shadow, but the blackness of the background is seeping out from below, giving a material density to the blackness. This panel, especially the panel on the right, is echoed in a later Bacon painting, figure at a wash basin. Both figures appear to only just manage to hold themselves together using the sink as support. We cannot be sure what the figures are doing hunched over the sink, but the twisting, buckling, warped way in which they collapse onto the sink strongly suggests they are being violently sick. The bodies appear to pulse with the suggestion of movement. The latter figure in particular seems to almost be vibrating through the way the human body blurs into its shadows. Especially for those for whom vertigo-induced nausea is in fact a part of everyday life, this mode of representing and evoking vertigo reminds us powerfully, viscerally, of the effect of vertigo on our guts. To conclude, the many meanings of vertigo are constructed through people's lived experience, through medical scholarship, and through literary and cultural representations of material and metaphorical vertigo. Across all of these forms of discourse, vertigo comes to be defined through a dynamic of what we allow to enter into our body and what we expel from it. As an experience that troubles the threshold between me and the world, between my body and the rest of the world, both materially and metaphorically, vertigo disturbs, but by definition also then reconstitutes my sense of self. If Christopher is correct to attribute abjection to what disturbs identity, system, order, what does not respect borders, positions, rules, the in between, the ambiguous, the composite, then vertigo is perhaps the most fundamental, disorientating, and transformative example of abjection. Thank you so much. I'm sorry you missed a lot of the slides. I'll try and stop sharing the screen now, and I hope that was interesting.
Thank you so much, sir. And now we will run through a small question and answer session. So, should we ask the audience to write question in the comment box, or
Whatever people feel comfortable, you can write questions. You can ask me. Happy with anything.
Okay, sir. So if you have any question, so you just can you just unmute yourself and ask the question. Yes, sir. One question come from our admin panel.
I'll give me a second to read the question. So I'll read it out loud. Might one view vertigo and dizziness in terms of existential nausea, akin to Sartre's nausea, triggered by the encounter with an insurmountable, historically laden otherness within one's own cultural or racial identity? In what ways does this encounter with an offended stomach expose deeper philosophical questions about the internalization of historical oppressions and their embodied contradictions in one's sense of self? Thank you for the detailed, important question. Yes, it does. There's a tradition of using vertigo to talk about precisely that internalization of historical oppressions. Fanon writes about vertigo as a consequence of colonial oppression in various different places, and I guess my point is that's yes, one can view vertigo as that. People have viewed vertigo and dizziness in those terms, but the viewing vertigo as that is different if you are living with vertigo, I guess. That's not to. It doesn't mean to say that the metaphor is illegitimate or not helpful or any of those things, but the metaphor and the lived experience need to be connected together. And it is really interesting that vertigo as a lived experience, as a material sort of symptom, is almost completely absent from literature and culture and philosophy. Hardly anyone ever talks about it. It is only ever spoken about as metaphor, and that process is really interesting to me. A question from Rakhi: could the concept of an offended stomach in response to foreign ingestion be historically mapped onto experience of forced assimilation? How might this crisis of ingestion in historical narratives reflect a broader embodied resistance to cultural erasure, where vertigo serves as a philosophical dizziness confronting loss of historical autonomy and memory? Again, I agree, but it is also in the process acting out a different kind of erasure. So in my interviews, people have said it again and again. Someone said, like, my family don't understand what vertigo feels like, and I feel like if I could point to a plaster or point to a bandage or something, then people would understand better. So, there are lots of examples of hidden disabilities, of course, and a lot of the practitioners around those disabilities and activists around those hidden disabilities make the same point, that it's hard for people who don't share it to understand. So what I'd say is that, again, the metaphor is really useful, really helpful, and you can see why the metaphor is working the way it is. But in using vertigo to metaphorize a particular form of cultural erasure, you are enacting another form of erasure. Is my response, I guess. Any more questions?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
So one of the question from Arnob.
Yeah. Through Foucault's lens of biopower, how might the crisis of ingestion symbolize a rebellion against power structures, that have sought to discipline the body and mind across history. Could the feeling of vertigo be an embodied visceral resistance to biopolitical control, a way for the body to express an unresolved conflict between individual agency and societal pressures to assimilate or conform? So this is a really central question that I've been working through in my own work, which is there are lots of examples of vertigo, of the vertiginous perspective allowing something different, allowing entry into a different world. So if you think one obvious example for those of you who know the film Wizard of Oz, the 1939 Wizard of Oz film, there there's a sequence in which where Dorothy's cottage enters into Oz, and that's literally through vertigo. The cottage spins like this on its axis, mimicking vertigo. And you can see why. Again, you can see why vertigo, through in various different forms, allows for a disruption of hegemonic perspective and the philosophical potential of using it as a metaphor to think about entry into a different world, a utopian world, a wonderland, whatever. All of that is, as I said before, I understand all of that. The point is, none of this recognizes exactly how unpleasant it is. Any one of you who've lived with it, I hope no one has. It is really, really unpleasant, and it's really unpleasant in a way that you can't quite articulate. It's really hard to describe what it feels like. It reminds me a little bit, for those of you who know Elaine Scarry's work on pain. Elaine Scarry talks about pain being the limits of the language, that you can't, it's hard to use language to explain pain. And I think that is even more so for vertigo, for dizziness. It's really hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it exactly what it feels like. Another question about Baudrillard. Baudrillard's theories of hyperreality suggest that we live in simulations rather than realities. Could the physical sensation of dizziness or vertigo represent a somatic projection of the hyperreal, as the body senses a crisis of ingestion, not of food, but of symbols, signs, and simulated histories? How does this speak to our inability to fully digest modern histories, constructed simulacra? There's another chapter in which I talk about vertigo as associated with technology, specifically video games, virtual reality, and screen-based interactive technology. And that, again, there is a commonality across philosophy, theory, and physiology and medical science, because it is established medical science that cyber sickness is a thing. Vertigo as a result, as a physiological consequence of using the screen-based technologies that we all have to do, use in our daily life. So there'll be another chapter of my book which is about that. And if you think of the technological aspects of Baudrillard's theory, so I'm thinking of films like, if you know the film Inception, for example, which is a film about, not unlike Alice in Wonderland or Wizard of Oz, is about transporting oneself from reality to dream, and is this a simulated world or is this a real world? And throughout the film, vertigo gets used as a metaphor to describe describe this travel between one world and another world. I'll come back to the same point, of course, that it's not just that this is a metaphor that involves an erasure, but it is a metaphor that actually evokes vertigo. There's the vocabulary of vertigo that I was talking about, using the paintings as an example, or indeed cinema as an example, where the particular cinematic techniques that are used to describe, used to construct the metaphor. Think about jerky camera, handheld camera, extreme low angle or extreme high angle shots. All of these have the potential to evoke a particular material, vertigo. So it's not just that we are using a metaphor we are metaphorizing a material symptom in order to make a philosophical point, in the process erasing the lived experience of that material symptom. And we are doing it in a way that actually evokes vertigo. So Marissa, one of my other interviewees, I didn't quote her today, but I quote her a lot throughout the rest of my work. She talks about how uh, when she's watching TV and there is a lot of handheld camera and shots and action shots, she has to look away from the screen and try to find something with a straight line because she needs that to reorient herself. So yeah, again, I feel like I'm repeating myself, but across all of these different philosophical schools, existentialism, postmodernism, hyperreality, simulation, you can see why philosophers again and again have used vertigo to make their point, and that's absolutely fine, and I can see why. I would guess none of them have ever experienced vertigo. I think if they did, it wouldn't be quite as attractive to them.
Sir, there is a question from Pallab Boirago. The question is, in the light of Sartre's existentialism, could the sensation of an offended stomach reflect a body that rebels against the bad faith imposed by the dominant historical narratives? Is vertigo an embodied crisis that arises when individuals feel trapped by historical roles and identities, experiencing nausea at the thought of their existence being defined by past oppression or false historical interpretation?
Thank you. There is a really interesting way in which the vertigo as a response to historical, political violence and trauma straddles that boundary between metaphor and symptom. So I'm thinking there is a for understandable reasons a very controversial art exhibition called Art Guantanamo Art. So this is an exhibition of artwork created by prison inmates at Guantanamo Bay, and one of them is called Vertigo. If you Google Vertigo Guantanamo, you should be able to see it. It's a series of colored dots in a concentric circle, and it was painted by someone called Ahmed Al-Baluchi, who remains in Guantanamo as accused of being one of the masterminds behind 9/11, and he drew that painting to explain what torture feels like. There is a lot of medical scholarship that demonstrates that vertigo is a recognized physiological symptom, a consequence of torture. Makes sense why. I mentioned Fanon before. Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, there's a bit where he talks about um, uh, a revolutionary fighter, anti-colonial revolutionary fighter, who Fanon spoke to in his capacity as a psychiatrist, and he was talking about vertigo. This man was suffering from vertigo as a result of the trauma of the war. So again, there is this connection uh, between a metaphor of vertigo used to describe historical violence, political violence, systems of dominance and oppression, and vertigo as an actual identifiable physiological response to that kind of violence and torture. Um, and I think both of those need to be studied together.
Thank you, sir. And we have we have one question left in the chat box, and this is from Sayantan Sarkar. In Nietzsche's philosophy, the will to power confronts the fragility of existence, often leading to a sickness of modernity. Could the offended stomach represent a Nietzschean response to the will to power exercised by dominant historical narratives over marginalized voices? How might the sense of dizziness and rejection manifest as an embodied crisis against the eternal recurrence of historical dominance and oppression?
I think I have answered this question. but Shantan, please tell me if I haven't. The point about Fanon and Al-Baluchi, I think, answers that question about using vertigo both as a metaphorical consequence of historical dominance and oppression, and a physiological consequence of individuals who are facing violence and torture. And there's the question about Bodhvia, I think I answered. There's a question about from Potit Pawan Boywaggo, about how would White's notion of historical narrative as a linguistic construct apply to the idea of ingestion and physical response of vertigo? Could this crisis be read as a reaction to the overconsumption of constructed histories that fail to authentically represent reality? Does the body through this offense reveal a deeper metaphysical rejection of the truths embedded in historical representations? I'm not a historian. My knowledge of history as a linguistic construct comes more from sort of critical theory. That's my background. I feel like I'm repeating myself answering all the questions, but I do think the same point applies, that all of I said at the start that the metaphor of vertigo can seem to me like it is so widespread and so multifaceted that it feels like vertigo can become anything, can mean anything. There is a problem with that, because if it means everything, it also means nothing. And there's a problem because it doesn't recognize, there isn't any sense anywhere at all in all of these metaphors that it's a thing that people have to live with, right? If it is how can I phrase this in a way that makes sense? If our conversation about vertigo exists only at the level of metaphorical resistance, metaphorical response to historical and current forces of domination and power, then the conversation isn't happening about, that person who lives with vertigo and needs to go up and down stairs. There isn't a decent banister that they can hold on to. There isn't a conversation about someone who lives with vertigo and has to go shopping, and across a supermarket there is no seats. There are no seats anywhere, right? So the fact that vertigo as a material construct as a material symptom, as a physiological symptom, is never spoken about, means that the questions about practical design, the questions about support systems, more accessible design isn't happening, because we only ever think of vertigo in the context of a metaphor for existential crisis.
I think there is no question in the comment box. So any more questions from the audience? If no, then we can conclude the session.
Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and I hope that was interesting.
Yes, sir. It was a good, wonderful experience for us to know a very unique and new thing for a student of history to be specifically. And all of our members are currently pursuing their masters, and I have just finished my masters, and it's a good experience to hear from you. And this lecture will also will be streamed in our YouTube channel later.
Okay. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
So now